Hey, welcome back to InfoGamer. For this video, we're going to continue our PlayFabs tutorial series. In this video, we're going to teach you how to get the players to log in, and we're going to do our first API call. Now, before we begin, make sure that you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you can get updates when we publish new videos. So here I have my project open inside of Unity, and the first thing that we're going to do is create a new script. So I'm going to click on my assets folder. I'm going to go to create, and then I'm going to select folder. We can then rename this to scripts. Inside the scripts folder, we're going to right click, go to create, and we're going to select C# script. We can then rename this script to PlayFabLogin. And then I'm going to open this script. Now the documentation for getting the players to log in says to replace this script with this script here. Now I'll include this script in the description below this video, and I'll also include a link to the documentation so that you can follow along. But let's run through this code real quick so that we can understand what it's doing. The first thing that you'll notice is the namespaces up at the top. The first one is using PlayFab. The second one is using PlayFab.ClientModels. And so you'll need to make sure that you're including these namespaces in your script. Next, in the start function, you'll see this if statement where we are setting the title ID if it is null or empty. Now you'll also notice that they've included this comment here that says setting the title ID here can be skipped if you have set the value in the editor extensions already. And then we have this comment here which says please change this value to your own title ID from PlayFab Game Manager. Now I believe since we've already set our title ID in the editor, we could end up just deleting this if statement, but since this if statement is only executing when our title ID is null or empty, there's nothing wrong with keeping it here. And if we're going to keep it, then we want to change this value. And so let's go back to Unity, and then we'll grab our title ID from the PlayFab's edX window, and I believe it's just the number value. And so I'll go back to our code, and I'll enter it in there. On the next line of code, we're creating a request for our players to log in. And then on the last line of code of our start function, we are submitting that request. We then have two callback functions. The first one will be executed if we successfully log in, and inside this function, we're just debugging a message to the console. In the second one, we are executing this function if we fail to log in, and in this function, we're debugging other messages to the console. Now let's save this script and we'll go back to Unity and test what they've given us. Once we're back in Unity, we first want to select our hierarchy. We then want to create an empty game object, and we'll call this our PlayFabsLogin. We can then select our PlayFabLogin script and drag it into the inspector. And then we can click play and see what kind of messages we receive. So here I have my console window and it says, congratulations, you made your first successful API call. Now if we go back to our script, you can see that that is the message that we debug to the console if we have a successful login. Now we're not quite done yet because the documentation says that this is an example script, and if we're wanting to actually publish our game, we should use a more appropriate method for logging in. Apparently, the method for logging in with a custom ID is more for testing purposes. Now, there's a number of different platforms that you can use to log in. If you're on an Android or iOS device, then you can use your device ID to log in. Or if you want to use Facebook or email, you can use those methods as well. And so I'm going to show you how to use the player's email to log in, because that's probably the most common one to use. And then maybe in the future I can show you how to log in with Android and iOS and maybe some of the other platforms as well. And so let's now comment out the last two lines of our start function, and then we'll create a new request. And so I'm going to type var request. I'm going to set it equal to new, and then I'm going to type login. And here you can see all the different platforms that you can use to log in. And the one that we're going to use is the login with email address request. We then want to add in curly braces, just like this line here. And for this next part, we want to create some new variables up at the top. So for the first variable, this is going to be a private string, and we can call this user email. The next one is going to be a private string, and this can be user password. Once we have these variables, we can go back into our curly braces, and the first thing that we're going to type is email, and we're going to set it equal to user email. The next one is going to be password, and we're going to set it equal to user password. We then want to end this line with a semicolon, and on the next line we're going to type PlayFab.ClientAPI, and then we want .login with email address. We then need parentheses, and in here we want to pass in our request variable. We then want to call our onLoginSuccess function and our onLoginFailed function. Now at the moment this won't work until we've set our user email and our user password variables. And so let's create some public functions that we can then pair to input fields and receive those values. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and here I'm going to type public void, and this is going to be our get user email. We then need to have a string parameter, and I'm going to call this email in. Inside this function, we can set our user email to email in. We then want to create another public function. This is going to be void, and this is going to be our get user password. We can then pass in a string, and we'll call this password in. And then we'll set our user password equal to password in. The next thing that we'll do is create a submit button that when the players click, it will use these variables to log them in to their account. So this is going to be a public void function, and we'll call this onClickLogin. We then want to copy our last two lines of our start function, and we'll paste them into this function. Now, even though we now have our user's email and our user's password, this still won't work until we've registered the player. But in case the player's already registered, we first want to try to log in, and then we're going to use the onLoginFail callback function to register the player. And so let's scroll up to that function. Inside this function, we can get rid of all the debug statements. We then want to create another request, but this one is going to be for registering the player. And so this is going to be var, and I'm going to call it register request. We then want to set it equal to new, and it's going to be register PlayFab user request. We then need to add in curly braces, and then we can set the email equal to user email, and we can set the password equal to user password. I'm then going to leave this line with a semicolon, and on the next line we're going to type PlayFab client API. We then want .register PlayFab user, and we're going to pass in our register request. For our second parameter, we need a different callback function that uses register PlayFab user result for its parameter. And so up here, I'm going to type private void, and we can call this onRegister success. And for the parameter, we need our register PlayFab user result, and we can call it result. And then in here, we can just copy this line here, paste it there. I'm then going to call our onRegister success for our second parameter. For our third parameter, we need a different callback function for when we fail to register a player, because if we call this same callback function, then we'll essentially be stuck in an infinite loop. And so after this function, I'm going to type private void, and then we'll call it onRegister failure. We can then pass in PlayFab error, and we'll call it error. And then inside this function, we can call debug.logError, and then pass in error.generate error report, parentheses, semicolon. And then we can call this function inside here for our third parameter. Now there's one more thing that I just realized that we need for registering our player, and that is a username. And so I'm going to scroll up to the top and I'm going to create a new variable. This is going to be a private string, and this is going to be called username. We then need to create a new public function that we compare to an input field. So I'm going to scroll down to here, and we're going to create a new public void, and I'm going to call this getUsername. We then need to pass in a string, and this will be called username in. And then inside this function we can set our username equal to username in. We can then scroll up to where we are creating our register request, and inside the curly braces I'm going to call username equals username. Now you'll notice that the first username has a capital U and the second one has a lowercase u. The second one is our variable that we created in this script. Now so far what we're doing is we're getting our player's email and our player's password from input fields that we're going to create in Unity. And then when our players click a submit button, we're then going to try and log them in using their email and password. If it fails to log them in, it probably means that they haven't registered. And so we're going to then try and register them using their email and password. Now at the moment, every time our players open our application, they'll be required to log in, and that can be annoying, and so we want to fix this. Now the easiest way that I can think to do this is to remember the player's email and password, and then when we start our application, to use the email and password to automatically log them in. And so we first want to remember their email and password, and we'll do this whenever they successfully register their account or when they successfully log into their account. And so in our onRegisterSuccess function, we're going to save the email and password into some player preferences. And so I'm going to call PlayerPrefs, and then I want to set string. We can then pass in the string key, which is how we identify this PlayerPref, and we can call this one email, and I'm going to use all caps. We then want to pass in the user email variable. On the next line, we'll call PlayerPrefs, and we'll set string, and this will be for password, and we'll set it to user password. I'm then going to copy these two lines of code, and we're going to paste them into the onLoginSuccess function. Now what we have to do is get these player preferences when we start our game and use them to try and log in. And so we already have where we try to log in, but we don't want to try until we've set these variables. And so I'm going to create an if statement, and we're going to check for PlayerPrefs.hasKey, and we're just going to pass in email. If our email key exists, then most likely our password key will exist as well, because we're setting those player preferences at the same time. And so if our email key exists, we then want to get both the email and the password and save it into our user email and our user password variables. And so I'm going to type user email equals PlayerPrefs.getString, and then we pass in the key email. We then want to type user password, and we'll set it equal to PlayerPrefs.getString, and we'll pass in password. Once we get those values, we'll then try to log in with the email and password. And if these values don't exist in the player preferences, then we won't try to log in with them on the start function. Instead, the players will have to then manually input their email and password in order to log in. Now there's one last thing that I'd like to do in this script, and that is we're going to have a UI panel which is going to display the different input fields for the email and the password. And once the player has successfully logged in, I then want to hide that panel so they don't have to deal with it anymore. And so to do this, we're going to scroll up to the top and we're going to create a new public game object variable. So I'm going to type public game object, and this is going to be our login panel. Then what we need to do is scroll down to wherever we successfully log in. So in our onLogin success function, we need to call our login panel and then say .setActive, and we're going to pass in false. And then we want to do that as well in our onRegister success function. So I'm going to copy this line and we'll paste it right there. Now we can go ahead and save our script and go back to Unity. Now there's a bit of setup that we need to do. The first thing that we need to do is create our login panel. And so I'm going to go up to our create drop-down menu, go to UI, and then I'm going to select panel. And then I'm going to right click on our panel, go down to UI, I'm going to select input field. And this can be for our username. I'm then going to readjust this input field so it's easier to see. We can then select this input field and duplicate it. I'm then going to move the duplicate down in our scene, and we can then duplicate it one more time and move that one down in our scene. I'm then going to select our first duplicate and I'm going to rename it to email, and we can also change the placeholder text. I'm then going to select the last duplicate and I'm going to rename it to password. We can then select the placeholder and change it to password. Then what we can do is we can select our email input field and we can change the content type to email address, and then we can select our password input field and change the content type to password. Then what we need to do is right click on our panel, go down to UI and select button. I'm then going to move that down in our scene so it's below our input fields, and I'm going to readjust the size. Now what we need to do is assign the different functions to these UI elements. And so I'm going to select our username input field. I'm going to scroll down to onValueChange. I'm going to click the plus sign. I'm then going to select our PlayFabLogin game object and drag it into this field here. And I'm going to use the drop-down menu to go to PlayFabLogin, and I'm going to go up to Dynamic Strings. I'm going to select Get Username. I'm then going to do the same thing for the email. I'm going to click the plus sign on the onValueChange, drag in our PlayFabLogin. I'm going to go to Get User Email. For the password, I'm going to do the same thing, plus sign. I'll then get the PlayFabLogin and use the drop-down menu to select Get User Password. And then for the button, I'm going to click the plus sign on the on-click, get the PlayFabLogin, drag it in there, drop-down menu, go to PlayFab, and then select on-click login. Now the last thing that we need to do is select our PlayFabLogin game object, and then I'm going to grab our panel and drag it into our login panel variable. Now we can test it out and see if it works. So I'm going to click play. I'm then going to enter in a username. I'm then going to enter in my email, and then we can enter in a password, and then we can click login. And then here in the console you can see that it says congratulations, you made your first successful API call. Now when I double click on this message, you can see that it took us to this debug statement in our onRegister success function. Now what we can do is we'll go back to Unity, we'll stop our game. Then what should happen when we re-enter our play mode is we should automatically be logged in and our login panel should disappear. And so let's clear the console. I'm going to click play, and there we go. It says congratulations, you made your first successful API call and our login panel has disappeared. Now when I double click on this, you can see that it took us to the debug statement in our onLogin success function. So the first time was in our onRegister success function, and the second time was in our onLogin success function. Now one more thing that I could test is I could delete our player preferences and then I could try just logging in with my email and password. And so I'm going to scroll up to our start function. I'm going to type PlayerPrefs, and then we want to delete key. And I'm actually going to select delete all because that's easier. So now when I click play, you'll see that our login panel hasn't disappeared. And so I'm going to click play one more time to stop it, go back to our code. We don't need to delete our player preferences anymore, so I'm going to save that. We'll go back to Unity, and now when I click play, you can see that it still isn't there because we've deleted those player preferences. But now I'll try and recreate those player preferences. Now I don't need to type in the username because I've already registered. I just need to type in my email and then my password. So I'm going to click login, and there we can see it says congratulations, you made your first successful API call, and that is in our on login success. And so now when I stop it and I click play, you can see that our player preferences have been recreated and we're automatically logging in once again. So that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to log in using PlayFabs. Now in the future I'll have to show you how to log in with some of the other platforms, but I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you did, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave them in the comments below, or join our Discord server, which is linked to in the description below. And finally, make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.